Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for projects, ideas, and initiatives that try to imagine futures free of oppression, domination, exploitation, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we maintain is this one, Trek Wars at OSU, in which we use the major science fiction and fantasy franchises of Star Trek and Star Wars and others to help us understand matters arising in contemporary society. So today, an episode on why you probably want to get your history from someone other than a Kelpian. So I often joke with my friends that my role on a starship would be as the chief humanities officer. There's a chief science officer, after all. So what would be the role of a chief humanities officer? This would be to advise the captain on matters of historical or philosophical importance. And a recent episode on Star Trek Discovery made me realize that you probably do want to have something like a chief humanities officer on board. What I'm referring to is a conversation that happens in episode 5 of season 3, in which Captain Saru gives us an Earth art history lesson that in some ways is way off. Now, I've seen a lot of people online talking about this and agreeing that the history is probably incorrect here. But more than that, I think that what's important to talk about here is why it's important for Star Trek to get its history right. It's not just a matter of historical accuracy, but to also recognize that history matters in terms of the kind of future that we want to build. And so getting that history right is a political act that gives us a springboard for trying to imagine better, more just kinds of futures. And I think that the conversation that takes place in episode 5 is one that's problematic from that kind of standpoint. So I want to talk about Giotto, the Dark Ages, and Star Trek Discovery. So if you've been following Star Trek Discovery, you know that the Discovery has had to be launched 900 years into the future to protect the sphere data, the information of this ancient civilization that invaded Discovery in season 2. It's had to take this data and protect it from control, the out of control artificial intelligence that was created by Starfleet shortly after the Federation Klingon War that took place in season 1. Control decided to try to acquire this sphere data in order to use it to be able to wipe out all sentient life in the galaxy. And so the plan was hatched in season 2 to take this data into the future to preserve life for all of the galaxy. So season 3 has opened with Discovery 900 years now in the future. And the future that they find here is one that's very, very different than the galaxy that they know. For one thing, Starfleet and the Federation are very, very different kinds of organizations. We find out that Starfleet at some point reached a peak of 350 member nations, but about 120 to 150 years before the events that take place in season 3, there was a disaster across the galaxy called the Burn, in which dilithium fueled warp drives all were destroyed in some inexplicable event. And so warp capability has become something that is very rare in this new universe. And the Federation has fallen into disarray. So from a height of about 350 member nations, it now member states, it has now maybe less than 35 planets that belong to the Federation. So Discovery is trying to find its way in this new galaxy and trying to find its place. And so in episode 5, we find the Discovery meeting up with the remnants of Starfleet. And there is an attempt to try to show Starfleet that Discovery still has a role to play in this new galaxy. And at the end of episode 5, there's a conversation between the head of Starfleet, Admiral Vance, and Captain Saru. And Saru decides to try to show the importance of discovery by using a metaphor from Earth history. He talks about the Italian Renaissance painter Giotto. And so he tells Admiral Vance that in a period that is known as the Dark Ages in Earth history, humanity was under siege from wars and plagues. Moreover, it was losing its way. Then he says, Giotto came forward and invented the three-point perspective in painting. Giotto helped to spark the Renaissance when with his art, he inspired people, Saru says, for the first time in a long time, to look up and give new depth and perspective to his paintings. And in this way, Giotto helped Europe move out of the Dark Ages into this period of cultural flourishing that's called the Renaissance. Now, what's interesting about this story is that it relies on a kind of cultural classification system that many historians now are getting rid of. Many historians don't like this classification scheme of the Dark Ages and then the Renaissance, because it doesn't really fully capture what was going on in Europe at this time. And so partly what I wanted to do is, when I was watching this episode, was to think about where this talk of the Dark Ages come from. What's the history of this idea? And what I found was that the metaphor of the Dark Ages is largely attributed to the Italian Renaissance poet Petrarch. And one really good example of Petrarch using this metaphor comes from Petrarch's epic poem, Africa, from 1343. Petrarch here is trying to talk about a new way of thinking about history. And so in Africa, Petrarch writes, "My fate is to live among varied and confusing storms. But for you, perhaps, if, as I hope and wish you will live long after me, there will follow a better age. This sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance." So the way that Petrarch is talking here in terms of thinking about history is in terms of dark and light eras. And he thinks of his own era in Europe in the 1300s as a kind of dark era in comparison to the light era of the Roman Empire. For Petrarch, this was a period of cultural flourishing, of political stability, in which his era pales in comparison. And so he hopes for a future in which there will be this renaissance of this cultural production and political stability that he idolizes in the Roman Empire. And so what's interesting about this talk that Saru gives to Admiral Vance is this kind of idealization of empire as what the Federation should be shooting for, a kind of political stability and alliance that is empire-like. What's interesting, though, is the way that he portrays the discovery as sort of like what Giotto did for the Renaissance, of providing a new way of looking at things. And so here's a famous painting by Giotto called Christ Before Caiaphas. And you've seen here an art historian provide a depth and perspective analysis to this painting. What you see here is that what Giotto is able to do is to provide paintings that give a sense of motion and of depth, so that there seems to be a kind of 3D realism on a two-dimensional surface. And so this is the new way of seeing things, of making paintings seem more realistic by giving them a sense of movement and depth that had not really been seen very much of in European painting up to that point. Brunelleschi is known for using things like the camera obscura tool, and also for building different kinds of peep instruments to allow him to see the world in new and different ways with new perspective. And so Brunelleschi was known, for instance, to experiment with a device like this, that you would create a plate with a small peephole and mirror that would allow him to see things in a kind of 3D fashion. And then he would be able to paint from this perspective. There's also examples of him using camera obscuras, that is, being seated in a room, a box-like room with a pinhole that allows the light to portray the images from the outside on a far wall. And so Brunelleschi is known to have thought of his architectural projects and his paintings using this new form of optical technology that was becoming known throughout the Renaissance world at this time. What's really fascinating to realize is the recognized expert in optics during this time period was a Muslim scholar by the name of Ibn al-Haytham, or as he's known in Latin, Alhazen. Alhazen was recognized as the premier scientist in optics, and he published a famous book called the Book of Optics in 1011, and from 1011 to 1021 that he was writing this. And the book itself is recognized as one that provided, first off, many important accounts of things like rainbows and rays of the sun, and how the eyes worked to produce images. And Alhazen was recognized as perhaps the leading scholar in these areas. And so when Brunelleschi is working with his camera obscura to try to envision how to think about the world with depth and in 3D, he was working with technology that had first been talked about by Alhazen. Alhazen was someone who talked quite explicitly in his work about the idea of a camera obscura. Now, a camera obscura was something that was known in China and had been built before in China. But in Europe, the reference to camera obscuras comes from Alhazen's work. So the vision that Brunelleschi had to build the dome, to think about his paintings, and the kind of optical renaissance that's represented by these painters was something that in some sense is owed to the prior work of Alhazen. And this is not something that we are now sort of creating. In fact, it was recognized during the modern era in Europe that Alhazen was someone to contend with. And it's only now that we are recovering what was known to people at the time and in what we now know as the modern era. People starting in the 1600s recognized these Muslim Jewish philosophers as important to keeping up the science, the medicine, the physics, the optics, and the philosophy of quote unquote Western society. So to show that Alhazen was recognized as a figure in the Renaissance and the modern era, we have here a cover of Johannes Hevelius's Selenographia, which is a book about the surface of the moon. This came out in 1647, and it was a groundbreaking text on astronomy. What's interesting about this text is the cover of the book has a depiction of Alhazen here on the left, representing reason, and Galileo Galilei on the right, representing the senses. So in the modern era here, we're seeing a Muslim scholar on par with someone that we usually take to represent one of these geniuses of the European Renaissance, co-equal together. So it's recognized that a lot of the work of the Italian Renaissance was something that we owed to the work, the ingenuity, and the preservation tactics of Muslim and Jewish philosophers, largely in the Muslim area of Europe in Al-Andalus. I think that there are some political reasons why we should pay attention to these kinds of stories. And I'm thinking particularly here of Dr. Sarah Bond. Dr. Sarah Bond is a professor in classics at the University of Iowa. And so in 2017, she wrote a popular article based on some of her research in which she talked about how statues in the Roman era were not these alabaster figures, these pure white figures. In fact, they were probably very colorful, and that statues were meant to be appreciated for their color. And in some sense, they were quite garishly painted. What happened is that Dr. Sarah Bond started to receive enormous amounts of death threats for these observations, particularly from alt-right groups who felt that her talking about the multicolored nature of European art in the classical period was an attempt to downplay the whiteness of Western European civilization. And so for these lessons on art history, she started to receive a lot of death threats. I think that this is the case because right now we're in this time in which we're at a culture war about what the meaning of white or European civilization is about. One of the groups that has become very prevalent amongst the alt-right in the past few years is a group called Identity Europa. And here on the left, you see some of their propaganda using statues, classical looking statues that talk about serving your people, our future belongs to us. What they're talking about here is that there's a kind of white culture that needs to be preserved that's being lost to multiculturalism, and that there's a duty amongst white people to preserve this heritage. And so Identity Europa was one of the groups that started this campaign of slandering Dr. Sarah Bond and arguing that she was helping to obscure the accomplishments of white Europeans. Now, Identity Europa is not not necessarily an obscure fringe group. We've seen the kind of work that they do. So in 2017, members of Identity Europa were behind the planning of the alt-right gathering in Charlottesville, Virginia, that turned into this spectacle of white supremacist organizing. And here, in fact, you see one of the torchbearers in the big march in Charlottesville. The shirt that the person is wearing bears the logo of Identity Europa. And of course, the motto that was being announced at Charlottesville was, "Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us." So at the heart of a lot of alt-right propaganda and organizing is this belief that there is an attempt to obscure the accomplishments of white people and white culture. And so there's a cultural battle about what exactly classical civilization in Greek and Roman eras was like. And to start talking about other influences into Western civilization is dangerous to these people. And I think that that's why it's important that we get these moments correct, because there are people that are using the ideas of the Renaissance, of the Dark Ages, of the Roman Empire, and of Greek culture to prop up a certain perspective of white supremacy in our world today. The showrunners of Discovery are trying to portray a future that's extremely diverse, with a large representation of many different kinds of people in the future. But that means that we get our history right, and that we recognize that our past was also multicultural, was also diverse, and that there were many different influences that created what we now know of as European history. I think that's why it's important, when we're trying to imagine a diverse future, that we have an accurate sense of the diversity that exists now and that has existed in the past. The Renaissance was a period of a lot of new innovations in science and technology, in art and in politics. And part of the reason that all of these innovations took place was, yes, partly because of genius, but also because there was a rich undercurrent of scholarship going on that is due to the fact that Muslim and Jewish scholars were working along with Christian scholars to preserve a heritage and to make new innovations. And this groundswelling of work is responsible for inspiring the work of people like Giotto and Brunelleschi, who we credit with creating this period of the Renaissance. And so the Dark Ages were not a period of war and famine and humanity losing its way. That's only really true if you don't consider the kind of work that was being done in places like Toledo or Cordoba, places where Muslim and Jewish scholars were doing enormous amounts of work. So I think that for these kinds of reasons, for imagining diverse futures, it's important that we get this history correct so that we can really think about the kinds of futures that we want to model. And it may be a kind of future that's modeled on the work that was going on during these dark ages in human history. And so maybe that's why you don't want to get your history from a Kelpian. I'd be interested to hear what you think. What are your thoughts about this battle over history and the way in which we imagine our futures? Drop us a comment down below and let us know your thoughts. You can find out more about the Anarres Project if you find us on social media. We are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Anarres Project, or you can contact us at our website, which is anarresproject.org. Until next time, live long and prosper.